I'm Julie Livingston here for another edition of PR Patter, my weekly show where I get to talk to the amazing people from across my public relations and marketing network. It's great to be here today. And I did want to just remind you that if you're interested in raising executive visibility in your company, visit my website at wantleverage.com and download our free tip sheet. Make your C-suite stand out on LinkedIn. That's what we do, and we'd love to talk to you about creating a program to raise executive visibility in your company. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome my guest, Gary Rieger. Gary's fascination with the technology began at the early age of 11, and he's going to tell us more about that, when he started getting curious about computers. So this has been like a lifelong love affair with technology and computer technology. This early interest blossomed into a self-taught career in software engineering, leading him to consult for local businesses and eventually to his current role as a product manager and software engineer at Hay Layer and Bklyn, or Bklyn Software Inc. Throughout Gary's career, he's demonstrated an exceptional ability to lead engineering teams and transform ideas into revenue-generating products. His expertise extends to developing go-to-market strategies and identifying lucrative revenue channels. Notable achievements include speaking at NFT.nyc, securing venture funding for a blockchain startup, and receiving an NIH grant for cancer-related technology. That sounds pretty cool, Gary. He's also very involved in his local community. He was a candidate for delegate in his district in 2020 and actively participates in local community events. You've got a great background, Gary, and I'd love to hear more about your backstory and kind of, how you got started, how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's really exciting, and I know we go quite a bit back, so it's
Yeah.
good. Yeah, it's good to you know um, do this with you. Yeah, I appreciate that. So the intro is really nice. So I come from the former Soviet Union. I was here. My family brought me over when I was 7 years old. A lot of that part of my life is a little bit of a blur, but ever since I was a kid, I was always sort of looking at the West, in astonishment. And when I think about that, it's like the stories your parents tell you, it's the things you see on TV, the cars that we couldn't have, and all these other things. And I think that brought me into this like mental state of really being fascinated with gadgets and futurism and the way the world could work, if you had the resources. And I think that's really what started it. So I never had a computer. I mean, I also grew up around a time where computers were really just started to sort of show up in people's houses. And we had AOL back then and Prodigy and all these things that many people these days probably don't even know. But when we came over to the States, I had an uncle here who was a CTO at a company in Pennsylvania who I've always looked up to. And it was my birthday, and he actually gave me a computer as a gift.
Oh,
Yeah, and it really opened my mind. And I kind of realized that the way I learn is sort of through breaking things and opening things. It's sort of like the person that does, you want to see how things fit.
sure.
And the way, I started tinkering with that computer was actually like messing with all the wrong files, going into the system directory, but I wanted to see what would happen. And that sort of allowed me to almost like reverse engineer how things worked. Because it was like, if this doesn't work, then why? And so it really got me into just the intricacies of like computers and computer systems and things like that. And it's kind of fascinating because later on, even in high school, when they put me in front of a computer to do like coding class, I really hated it. Like, I don't like the
Really?
mundane. Yeah, I did not like it. I never did well when it came to memorization of the code itself and understanding the language. Like, I really need to have dig my hands dirty and instead of memorizing things, I need to sort of like, learn, like I said, by doing, by breaking. And that was
Right.
really not like the way um, they generally teach. So I had to take it upon myself to learn all things computers, including like all, the languages that I've learned since then really were just self-taught.
That's
So
amazing. You have an incredible sense of curiosity, Gary, that kind of emerged when you were very young.
yeah, I guess you could say that. Yeah, I mean that's, one way of looking at it. There's many things I'm not interested in, and then there's many things that I am interested in that,
Right.
I focus on those. So
Right. But you seem to have a natural drive to learn, to constantly learn,
that is
which is
true. Yeah,
which is
I do.
very cool.
I love to learn. That's true.
It's
Yes.
great.
Thank
So
you.
Bitcoin has been around for some time, but some of us are more familiar about it with it than others. So I was wondering if you could just start today's conversation by explaining what Bitcoin is. And I realize that that can be a little tricky. Um,
It's a doozy, yeah, for sure. But there are ways to sort of explain it on a very high level. And I think that's sort of where I'll start. I mean, so when Bitcoin was released, it was around 2008. It sort of came about. Now we don't really know. So this is one of the interesting parts about Bitcoin. We still don't know who created it. So there's a pseudonym,
really?
right? Yeah, we don't know who created it. We know that it was a person who used a pseudonym by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto, which just makes it that much more kind of weird and curious at the same time. Interesting. But we don't know whether it was actually a person, whether it was a group of people, where they are in the world. There are bulletin board messages between a Satoshi Nakamoto and other people in the cryptography community, because that's a lot of the things that are a lot of the things that make Bitcoin work are uh, tied to cryptography and cryptographic puzzles and things like that. But the goal when it was released was sort of to kind of rethink money. I mean, it really was a way to rethink money. And what I mean by that was around that time, if we remember, we had a pretty tough economic environment here in the U.S.
Yes.
Yeah, a lot of issues coming, I think tied generally to the real estate and the real estate bubble and the crash that came afterwards. And it was sort of like this thing that governments do, and it's totally normal because it's part of US like monetary policy, that if there's a problem in the economy, we can borrow or print quote unquote money to alleviate that problem. So if we need to put more money into the system, we can do that. If we need to take out money, and a lot of that is done literally by creating money. Some of it is through debt. That there's more complex scenarios there. But the bottom line is that there's something artificial about that. Because you generally cannot make things out of thin air, and when you do, just like everything in life, and I'm a big believer in like equilibrium and kind of homeostasis. That there's sort of like this norm that needs to exist, and there's a balance between all things. And so generally, anytime you, let's say, put money into a system, what happens is dollars get devalued because there's too much money out there. So there's all these things. And I think Satoshi Nakamoto tried to solve that problem. He said, what if there was a way to create money that wasn't basically in the control of the few, but in a system that really had no leader, and it's a
Right.
very honest system. And so the way he did it was he basically, said that why can't we use all existing computers on the planet? So whoever wants to participate, right? There's no force. But if you want to participate, you can sort of turn on your computer and make it part of a network. And everyone in the network is essentially holding up the system. So what that means is that Bitcoin exists because there are computers on the planet that want it to exist. And they have essentially turned on what's called, mining. So their computers solve certain cryptographic puzzles, which is sort of the energy you need to get Bitcoin running.
Right.
So the computer is solving these problems using energy. And then by solving these problems, you're creating Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is literally mined. It's created, but it's not created out of thin air, right? Just like we said, it's actually created by doing something. So there's an equal trade-off. So you have to spend a certain amount of energy to get a certain amount of Bitcoin. And generally speaking, the amount of energy you spend is equal to the value of that Bitcoin you get back. So it's a one-to-one relationship. And over time, it actually gets harder to get Bitcoin, which makes sense, so that the energy you need to use is more and more because Bitcoin becomes scarce and scarce. So it gets harder
Right,
to get.
right.
So he created by decentralizing, that's a big word in Bitcoin, decentralization, by giving the power from a few to the many, essentially, which that's what drives me, is this idea of sort of democratizing money. You sort of take the power away from the few and you give it to the many. And there's a couple of really good books. The Bitcoin Standard is one of them. And it just talks about, actually, if you think about back in the day, how money used to work. Like, we used to have, I mean, I think it started, if I remember the book correctly, it started with shells. Literally, people would use shells as currency.
I guess in ancient times, right?
Yeah, right. You'd have to get it. Like, it takes
Yeah.
work to find a shell. And then the way they keep, this is interesting, the way they keep account of money is a town would bring, let's just say the shells, a town would bring all their shells to the middle of the town, know how much there is in supply, and then have like an IOU system.
Oh,
So the slips would almost be like, here's my chunk in here. I put, everybody knows I put 5 shells in. And so we can kind of do this trade. But what Bitcoin allows is, it actually is, if you think about the replacement of current money. So today, like, there's a reason why cash is kind of going down, is that it's like, I can't give you cash where you are right now. I can only keep it local. It's dirty, like, literally, and so there's like a lot of weird things about cash that if there was a better system, like Bitcoin is one of those rare things that it just makes a lot of sense. Now, there's a ton of issues when it comes to the energy side, which, as we get further into our conversation, I can actually talk about. But the bottom line is, when it comes to something that in Bitcoin we say is hard money. So the other thing about Bitcoin is that it's tied to a computer program. So, for example, right now, if we wanted to know how much US dollars there are in circulation, there's probably a way to figure that out. We probably can go into some kind of website. The US will show us. But if we're all sort of being very honest here, and as much as I personally have very strong trust in the US government, we still take everything at their word, right? So whatever they put on that
sure.
website or whatever they put on
Right.
their report, there's assumptions. So there's this trust system that is inherent, almost, that exists. But with Bitcoin, it's like, imagine having a Google spreadsheet. This is one way I've described it, that everyone on Earth has a public view to.
Mm.
And that every single time there's a debit or a credit, it's in real time from the beginning of time. So not like as of today, from the first possible Bitcoin that ever existed. So what you have is not a system that I have to believe. I mean, I still, I guess, have to believe in the workings of Bitcoin, but there's ways to do that. But it's almost like this system that's like, hey, here it is. You can do the math if you want to. If you don't, there's some people that have already done it. But the bottom line is, any one of us today can go into Bitcoin, whether we're reading the white paper, there's certain things you can download into your computer, but we can actually do the math ourselves. And that's the beauty of one of the many beauties of Bitcoin. And so it's very like poetic in many ways. And a lot of people just kind of, it's almost weird that I talk about it that way. But to me, it is. It's very almost poetic. And when I learned about it, almost by chance, a client of mine actually mentioned it, and I thought it was a fairy tale. I really thought he was talking about, like kind of a Game of Thrones series. Because like, hey,
Right,
have you ever
right,
heard of Bitcoin
right.
with Satoshi Nakamoto? I really thought it was like a book, or like a fake story. But as I Googled it, and this was early 2016, I believe, I just got more and more fascinated. And so I haven't really looked back since.
That's Gary, you describe it so well, really.
Well, thank you.
So what does it mean to build on Bitcoin?
Yeah, so this is where things really get interesting. So Bitcoin is built on top of a computer system. And the computer system is a system that is like any other computer system. It's a programming language, essentially. Um, these languages are called smart contracts, which is it's a fairly new term, but I think it's going to get more and more popular over time. And what happens with a smart contract, because Bitcoin has such sort of predictable powers and a predictable nature to it in the way that it's created and the way that it's transparent, what happens is that every time there's a Bitcoin transaction, you can, within that transaction, what's making Bitcoin run is computer code. Now, you can't mess with the existing code. So you can never, it's one of the big things of Bitcoin is you cannot just change the Bitcoin code. And that's actually what makes it so immutable, as they say. But you can attach things to it. So it's almost like you can add additional code. It's kind of like when you have a contract and you have an addendum
Yeah.
piece, right?
Yeah.
And that addendum contract can be written. And so what's happening is people are doing things like, um, just give you an example. Let's say you have, uh, so in simple terms, let's say you have a wallet and you've got $100 in it, $100. And in a year, you have a son or a daughter, and we'll just go with one. We'll just go with son. You have a son, so we'll go with that one. So let's say your son turns 18, and you want to give that $100 to your son when he's 18. Okay. Now, in the current state of things, you would have to make sure that you're both in the same room. You'd have to make sure you're both in a position to receive the money, blah, 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 and you hand the money and everything's good. But in Bitcoin, you can code everything. And again, the code is immutable. So once you code it, you can never take it back. And what happens is
Oh,
Bitcoin says, so everyone has a digital wallet. So instead of a wallet with paper money, it's like a wallet on your phone or on your computer. It shows how much Bitcoin you have. And once you program it, that second that your son turns 18, no matter what you do, $100 is leaving your account and going into his account. It does not matter, it's just too late at that point, let's just say, because you've decided that at some point.
right.
And that is just one simple example of building on Bitcoin. But what you're really doing is it's not Bitcoin that matters at that point. It's actually I call it like Bitcoin is almost like the train, and the rails it sits on is the system that it was built on, which is so
Okay.
brilliant. And you can leverage that system to build other things, essentially.
So
Yeah.
could you, to make this more real for people who are watching, can you share with us a case study or two to illustrate how you've brought this together?
Sure. So lucky for me, when I was fascinated in Bitcoin, first I learned about Bitcoin. I read the white paper, which is kind of the first thing you want to do. And then I Googled, I said, how do you work with Bitcoin? What can you do with Bitcoin? Because I've heard of people doing things with it. And there's a company or I wouldn't say a company, it's an organization with a bunch of people, originally out of Princeton, who started to solve that problem back in a day by sort of figuring out how to anchor like whatever they're building these smart contracts onto Bitcoin. And with that, they also revealed their programming language. And what I did was I had a team of engineers because I had built out this Bklyn Co., which is a software consulting company, essentially, a development company. And I had asked some of my engineers, I said, hey guys, can you learn about this a little bit? Because I was kind of juggling a bunch of things. And I said, could we build something using this language? And the first thing we built was we leveraged the identity piece of Bitcoin. So the identity piece of Bitcoin is everyone gets an address. So you get sort of like a Bitcoin address. It's your address. It belongs to you. And again, because of the nature of decentralization, kind of like that public Google spreadsheet, once that address is tied to your name, you can't edit it. You can't remove it. It's always there. And so in that sense, it's always tied to you. And so what we did is we created a very simple file storage system. So think about like Dropbox.
Yes.
But the way
Okay.
it would work is once you first you would log in to your wallet, your Bitcoin wallet, which attaches that address to your name. So now you've got your own address. Once you've got your own address, you then can store files. Any file you store gets tied back to your address. Now, the interesting part of that, even though it kind of seems simple, is that unlike anywhere else in life where, let's say, just trying to think of a simple way to explain this. Let's say you had two Dropboxes, okay, or two Google Drives, and you had the same file in each Google Drive. You wouldn't really know unless you went further deep into which one is the real one, who put it there, who's the creator, like all of these things of minutia, which are actually very important,
Yeah.
especially for compliance, legal, government, all those things that are generally high stakes. You can't really know the true identity of the owner of those things. I mean, you kind of can, but there's limitations. With Bitcoin, there, like I said, with like everything else, there's no ands, ifs, or buts. It just is. And so what we created is this storage system that basically allowed you to upload files, and it acted almost as like a center of compliance. So that if I'm a person that added files to this system, they can always be tracked to me, if that makes sense.
Wow.
And that's just the basics of it. But what we realized was there was a lot of value there, and it's kind of an interesting angle. But we started working through, because of some of the people I started to work with, we started working with manufacturers who shared ingredient reports. So here's a great use case, like as you said. Let's say I'm a company that says, "Hey, you see this shampoo bottle? Well, it's super natural color, good for your kids, your pets, whatever. If they swallow it, like they don't die, kind of thing, right?" And then the question is, well, okay, you say that, but like I'm about to feed this to my kid, God forbid, to like my pet, whatever. No, I don't even want to do that. I'm gonna skip that
Yeah.
part of it.
Okay. Okay.
You know what I mean, right? Like
Yeah.
I don't want to like
Yeah.
endanger anybody. And so we had companies that say, you know what, we're going to give you information from our factories, from people that have signed off on this stuff, and then we'll store it on this database so that any single time in the future, if there's a way to go back and ask that question, like it's set in stone and we can prove it, and that's just one use case. I mean, you would be surprised, but I know a woman who's building a company, and what she's doing is when mothers in China have children, she records that into the blockchain because she has had a history of issues in China where they actually will switch out your babies or lie to you for whatever end goal that they have.
Right. Right.
And she's using Bitcoin to stop that from happening. So it's like when people think about Bitcoin, like you would never think that it's using in the medical field for, for
Right.
record keeping for
But
babies, for
there's an
existing.
application for it there.
Exactly.
So why would anybody think of building on Bitcoin, Gary? Like what would be the impetus for doing it?
I think so. There's something that's really important that's happening, generally speaking, that I think would make someone at least want to think about this. And it has to do with just the changes of the internet. We are at a time where the internet's been around for, say 30, feels less, but I think, roughly, let's just say 20 plus years. And, we're at a point where we're figuring out that, some of the things in terms of the way the internet was built was not really ideal. A lot of it has to do with data, right? So whether it's Meta now, Facebook, LinkedIn, X, who controls that data? What are they doing with your data? And so what's interesting with decentralized technology like Bitcoin, the question of ownership, because of all the things we just said, is never weary. It's never a gray area. You always know who owns what. And so within the systems of Bitcoin and other decentralized systems, and they already exist, like there's actually a Twitter that has been built on top of like Bitcoin infrastructure, quote unquote. Because what it does is it says, whatever I put is mine, whatever Gary says is Gary's, whatever Julie says is Julie's. No one can ever pretend it's not. And the internet is moving there because we are learning from our mistakes. People do want what we call a user-owned internet. So the user owns the data versus
Right.
a centralized system. And the internet's always sort of been this free place where we can go and find what we want, say what we want, good or bad. And so if we can preserve that and kind of move into the new era, that's the future. And so what's interesting is even today, so the nomenclature for decentralization, Bitcoin is Web3. That's kind of the new, because people say there was the Web 1, which was like, we didn't understand what was going on. Web 2 is what we know with social media.
Right.
Web 3 is the new internet. And all of this is Web3. So if you go on Google right now and you type in Web3 social network, you'll see that there's a ton of people building social networks, even LinkedIn variations on Web3 technology. You can do that with almost anything, even voting, which is fascinating to me. So I got into it because I've always been sort of at the intersection of like technology, finance, politics. Like these are the things that drive me. And I was like, it somehow solves all these problems at once. And yeah, so for anyone that wants to do something that, first of all, get in on a changing internet perspective that's early and be in early, but also, maybe they're fascinated about some of this nature of decentralization, this, nature of immutable data. It does solve a lot of problems. So I would just say, what's good is with ChatGPT, we can kind of get help these days, because even for me, like the Bitcoin white paper is fairly complex. And so whether it's that or just, watching some YouTube videos, really try to understand and then see if it's for you.
It's great. So let's say you decide that it is for you, and what are the steps you need to take to build on Bitcoin?
Yeah, I'm going to provide very practical steps. So the organization that I had found, and again, it's a decentralized organization, which means there's no one really at power. It's a bunch of companies that came together. It's called Stacks, Stacks. And if you look at Stacks, they have their abbreviation is STX. You can actually go in and read about the programming language that you can learn to build on Bitcoin. But more importantly, they have a Discord, they have a channel on WhatsApp and all these things where you can go in and you can literally talk to them and say, hey, what's my next step? I want to build on Bitcoin. And you have you have people that are engineers, attorneys, marketers, PR folks, everyone coming together who are essentially focused on building this Web3, this new internet, and they're there to help you. And what's interesting, because it's early and because not only, it's not like a small thing, there's governments all over the world that are focused on this. There's grant money out there too. And so this could be something that could really invigorate a lot of people who are kind of, lost and, if they're looking for something else to do.
That's such great advice. Gary, this has been really eye-opening for me. I didn't know that much about Bitcoin, and I just think you describe it so well and in such great detail. And you connect it back to, real world examples of like how it's being used and how it could benefit companies and I guess the world at large, right?
For sure.
How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so they can email me at hello@Bklyn Co. That's just one way, the website. And yeah, so what I'm doing these days is I write smart contracts. So these programming languages that work with Bitcoin. I've been sort of getting my hands dirty. And if anyone's curious on building on Bitcoin, whether it's me helping them write the contracts or pointing them, meeting them people, they can also send me an email. Also find me on X at Gary Reiger. Yeah, at Gary Reiger, on LinkedIn with my name. Any of these places would be good.
That's great. And I guess they can find you on LinkedIn as well.
Yes, by my full
Okay.
name. Yep.
Well, thanks so much for joining me today, Gary. I realized I mispronounced your last name. I'm sorry about that. But anyway, great to see you and great conversation. And everyone else, check out my website at wantleverage.com and download Make Your C-Suite Stand Out on LinkedIn. I'll see you